It has been a while since I've done any sort of an introduction, and since there has been a recent influx of a lot of new people who have discovered the channel, and because a lot is changing around here, I thought that I would sit down when I had a minute, which is right now, and do that today. My name is Cammie. I am autistic. I have ADHD. Since 2018, when I started this channel, that is something that I have spent a lot of time talking about. When I started this channel, I was not yet diagnosed, and I feel like I should stop here and say that some people, particularly a subset of new people who have not watched the channel, who haven't watched any other videos that I've made ever, who watched part of one video and came to the conclusion that when I said I'm autistic, that means I'm making excuses. Saying I am autistic is not so much an excuse as an explanation, and honestly not an explanation that I normally have to give. I was diagnosed at 37. I spent a good portion of my life feeling like I didn't fit, not understanding why I didn't fit, knowing that there was something that seemed very, very different about my brain. About college, I started to really realize that I felt like my brain worked differently than other people's, and not understanding why. The phrase I've heard in the past is where people say, like, there's something to finding out that you're a normal zebra and not a broken horse, or, you know, a normal unicorn and not a broken horse. And that was kind of how it felt to get that diagnosis, because it helped me answer a lot of questions about myself. For me, and for a lot of people who do find out they're autistic as adults, there's kind of like an aha moment where so many things that have happened leading up until that moment suddenly make a lot more sense. And that was how it was for me. If I'd never had kids, I doubt that I ever would have found out that I was autistic. And one thing that a lot of people wonder about is, how did you end up with 5 autistic kids? Because I feel like some people don't realize that children are not diagnosed when they are born. So here is the backstory, which if you've been here for a long time, you already know. Skip ahead, whatever. But if you're new, when our first kid came along, it was 2008, and she was a very, very colicky baby. She was awake pretty much every hour for the first year to 18 months of her life, and started sleeping through the night right before number 2 came along, and that was Maggie in 2010. Maggie was the opposite. When we were in the hospital after she was born, and we were there for 3 days because she was a C-section. When the doctors came in to check on her, I told the doctor that I was concerned that something was wrong, because she slept all the time. She was the type of baby that you had to wake up to feed, or she would have slept through the night from the time she was about a week old. And so that's what we did. We had to set an alarm to wake her up to feed her. And if she was in her bassinet, she was this perfectly happy baby. She was just very, very quiet, very, very low needs. But the second she started crawling, she was just off. The first time I remember it, we were having a picnic and she was crawling, so like probably 8 months old, and she just started crawling across the field without looking back. That happened several times, and then once she could walk, she would just be off running in one direction and just go and go and go. When she was diagnosed, she was 3. And she was our first child who was diagnosed. By then, we had a third child who was born in 2012, Patrick. Like his older sister, he was pretty laid back, not to the same level. He was kind of in between, I guess. He was a way easier baby than our oldest had been, because he wasn't colicky. I remember at that point asking doctor's appointments, because autism was still very much this big, scary thing, and everything that I read was very, very scary. All the doctors that I talked to said that we probably had like about a 10% chance of having another child who was autistic. Our oldest and our third, they both had speech delays, so they were in speech therapy, but that's all anyone thought that it was. And a lot of people in my husband's family and in my family had speech delays, so it was just sort of, you know, it didn't seem like a red flag for anything. When our fourth came along, James, that was 2014, and he is the only kid in our family who did not have a speech delay. He did start physical therapy at about 7 months old because of acute tibial torsion, and just the right side of his body was weaker than the left side. We knew he was going to be left-handed from the time he was tiny, because he did everything with his left hand. From the time he was very, very small, he had a huge vocabulary and sounded like a little college professor. And then very quickly after James, we found out that we were expecting Tessie, who was born in 2016. I remember being at a genetics appointment when I was pregnant with our youngest, because our pediatrician had referred our second daughter, who was the only child with a diagnosis at that time, to genetics. And I was in an appointment, and I was hugely pregnant. I think I had James with me, who was like 18 months and asking what the chances were. And again, everyone said like 10% probably, not very likely, not really all that increased, which seems pretty much like it was the standard answer at the time. And then Tessie was born, and I was certain before we left the hospital, before she was 3 days old, I knew that she was autistic. She didn't like to be held. She didn't like, I know that little tiny small babies don't make eye contact, but she would actually just never look at our face. Like usually with a really small baby, when they're nursing, they kind of look up at you. Tessie didn't. She never looked at my eyes. She is the sweetest, cuddliest, most loving kid. But from the start, I knew that she didn't like being touched like lightly on her skin. She didn't like being held if she wasn't being fed. She was happiest if she was down in her bassinet. Thankfully, I had a lot of experience at that point, both with just, general sensory issues. I'd learned a lot since Maggie had been diagnosed years earlier. Maggie and Tessie are 6 years apart. I kept her in like sleepers so that she wasn't getting that sort of light touch on her skin. And she started early on when she was 3 months old. They were already in the house for other kids, did an evaluation when she was 3 months old, and she did not respond to anything. Like they were clapping blocks above her head and she didn't respond. She didn't track things with her eyes. No, she is a kid who by the time she was 3 was taking things apart with like toy tools. In the middle of the night, one night she disassembled her high chair with like a toy screwdriver. That brings us to 2016, 2 years before I started this channel. We had 5 kids. Every moment of the day felt like it was taken up with therapy appointments for our older daughter and doctor's appointments and driving people to different things. So the progression of diagnosis is from there. When Tessie was 18 months old, she was diagnosed. It wasn't the sort of thing like there were questions. It was really, really obvious. Maggie and Tessie were both diagnosed at the time with what they called severe autism, what is also called level 3 autism, to help people understand, because that, I don't love the levels or but I understand that it helps people understand and that it's a question that comes up over and over again. So that is what their diagnosis was. At the time, our oldest daughter was about 11, and she was watching a lot of videos on autism made by autistic content creators, and she was watching them saying, this sounds exactly like me. We went to her doctor, and because she had the same doctor as her sisters, she was a doctor that was a pediatrician that knew a ton about autism. And she talked to her doctor, and her doctor said, yeah, I think it's really likely that you are also autistic, but what difference would what difference would it make if you got diagnosed? And Sadie said she wanted to know, so we went. And she was evaluated and she was diagnosed. I've probably gotten 1,000 comments over the last years about why would you put a label on a kid? And as someone who grew up without that label, you get other labels. For me, it was like cold, snobby, some version of those, stubborn, but mostly it was like cold and snobby, or two that I heard a lot when people didn't like me when I was younger. Maybe if you've never felt different, it's harder to understand why, I don't know. Knowing that there are other people who've gone through the same things that you can relate to, being able to find them because you have that label, can be helpful to some of us. And if you don't need that, you don't need that. But it can really help to not know that you aren't broken. And while I know that there are people out there who feel like autism is being broken, we don't believe that here. So Sadie was diagnosed. And when she was diagnosed, I started to think, wow, she's exactly like I was when I was a kid. She does the same things. And so I mentioned it to my doctor, and my doctor said, yeah, I think it's really likely that you are autistic. I'll refer you. I don't think your insurance will cover it, but let's do this. He made the referral, and I was diagnosed. I was really surprised by the ADHD part. I shouldn't have been. Then I started learning about ADHD and was like, oh, wow, yeah. Right at the same time, my oldest son, his doctor had referred him, and he and I were diagnosed on the same day. I think he was 7. James was evaluated about a year later. It kind of got pushed off because of COVID, and he was the last one in our family who was diagnosed. And in the midst of that, my husband was also diagnosed. That is how we found out we were autistic. And since then, I've been in a lot of different groups with parents of autistic kids, and it's not an uncommon story. It's not uncommon for parents of autistic kids to find out that one or both parents are also autistic, because that's just how it is. Since that time, those diagnoses and the start of this channel, a lot has changed. The kids have grown. We have one high schooler, one middle schooler, 3 elementary school kids. 3 of our kids are really verbal and don't have any sort of special education help at school. Our 13-year-old and now 7-year-old need more support. So Tessie is in a special classroom at a different school than our other kids, that has, higher level of supports than they can have, because we do live in a rural area, and Maggie goes to a special school that also has a lot higher level of supports for her. Both Maggie and Tessie understand pretty much anything you say. They don't communicate in the same way that their siblings do or that I do. Maggie has always been pretty good at getting her point across by listing nouns. That's sort of her thing. And she's really good at using nouns to tell you what she wants and to negotiate when she wants to do something. Tessie had about 10 words until this last year, and she hardly ever used them. She was good at expressing herself in other ways, but verbally she just didn't seem interested in words. And then this last summer she started singing along to songs all the time, and since then we've sort of had an explosion of language. She's still not just talking and telling us things. Like, she's asking a kid at school, are you okay when they're crying? Sadie said something about, usually Tessie cries when we don't go to a place that she wants to go to when we're out. She said, oh, look, Tessie didn't cry. And Tessie said, hey. And she said, did you understand what I just said? And Tessie goes, yeah, which is huge for this kid that, doesn't talk. In the beginning, I made videos every day. And I'm really glad that we have those memories. Maggie watches our videos constantly. She loves watching those old videos. And really, we all like seeing those videos come on and seeing how tiny Tessie and James were, especially hearing their little voices and seeing how much they've changed, is one of my favorite things about having had this channel over the past 7 years. As I mentioned in my other video, I'd backed away in the last few years because some of the negativity just got to be so much that it wasn't fun anymore, even though I like making videos. 3 of our kids were pretty vocal about not wanting me to stop. Maggie asked me just about every day in the last year if I was making a video that day. And I negotiated down to like Mondays, but then I haven't made a video for the last few months. And I think that break was good because I'm ready to start again. My plan right now is to do a sit down video on Fridays and do just like a day in the life or something like that on Mondays. So at the moment, that is what I'm planning on doing. And the kids have been really on board with that. One thing that you'll find here is that if one of my kids doesn't want to be in a video or doesn't feel like being on camera, they won't be. I've had people kind of notice that someone's not on camera and think it's like because I like that kid less or something. It's like, no, because I'm respecting my child's boundaries. Various kids have gone through various phases where YouTube was either really, really cool or really, really not cool. And I try really hard to respect that. The other thing is I will never show or talk about things that I think will embarrass my kids. Even if they think it's okay for me to share it, it's not something that I'm comfortable with. I definitely curate the parts of our lives that I'm willing to share. And I'm willing to share a lot more of my own experiences and about myself. I am not going to be talking about things that are going to be embarrassing to my kids. And when people ask repeatedly, especially embarrassing questions about my kids, that's something that I block just right away. Like, you're not going to get to ask creepy private questions about my kids here for the people that do that. And I know that's like a small number of people, but my main job is to protect them and love them and raise them and keep things as normal as I possibly can, especially as we're going through these major life changes. I've been talking for half an hour. I'm sure I'm going to edit this down to like 10 minutes maybe. I am back. I'm making videos again. I don't know if I'm going to do membership, so I'm figuring things out. I'm figuring out a schedule and when I'm going to post on different platforms and all of that, trying to make it come together. But I guess that is the introduction that I had been planning on doing for everybody who's new here. Welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I will see you in the next video. So yeah, until next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.